Welcome to today's talk, which is on reducing the suffering of painful memories, painful traumatic memories. And many of you will know that I'm a clinical psychologist. Well, I think you all know that. And I often work with people who have had scars to their psyche from experiences in the past. Often they're painful memories that leave a scar, and it's quite difficult to work with this for many individuals. The way these past behaviours affect individuals is in the way they relate to one another, in their behaviours, and in the way they experience emotions. So what I do as a psychologist is often just help these individuals overcome and heal from their past in the best way I can. And often I use and share strategies of serenity and insight meditation. In this talk, I'll be making reference to serenity and insight and the Eightfold Path. But I'll also be accessing a little bit of something from neuroscience, as well as what I know from clinical psychology. So just a warning, actually. Often people get overwhelmed in an untoward way when they're reminded of traumatic memories. And in this following talk, I'll make reference to traumatic memories. So please consider your own welfare and well-being. If you feel that you may be triggered in any way unhelpful, please take care of yourself. Be kind to yourself. And it may mean that you actually turn off listening to this talk and just put it aside for a while. Sometimes when I talk about this, sometimes what people may need to do is actually find someone they feel safe with, they trust, that can be with them while they listen to these talks while they listen to reminders of past traumatic experiences. Difficult experiences leave a scar on our psyche, and they affect our mental states and emotions and our relationships. It is, however, possible to uproot the suffering of these painful memories, and it requires insight and compassion. So there's a lot of ways we can start. There's a lot of strategies that I use in helping people overcome the pain and the suffering of their memories and their traumatic memories. But I want to start first of all with looking at emotions and a definition of emotion by Paul Ekman, who's a famous psychologist. He describes emotions as a process, a particular kind of automatic appraisal influenced by our evolutionary past and our personal past, in which we sense something important to our welfare is occurring, and a sense of physiological changes and emotional behaviours begin to deal with the situation. So emotions are very important in our lives. They've evolved for us to survive, to connect, and to thrive. And in balance, they save lives, they motivate behaviour, they are essential to the formation of relationships, and they are aroused in response to satisfaction or the thwarting of our basic needs. And they communicate these needs. So these are just the words of Paul Ekman. A constructive emotional behaviour is an emotion in the right amount, proportional to the event that calls them forth. We respond, all emotions have triggers that they respond to. The trigger for anger, for example, is when something gets blocked, and we need the energy of our anger to overcome that block. Sadness is an emotion that's triggered when we lose something, when there's a loss in our lives, I think sadness is a way for us to withdraw for a while, to process what our lives mean when we've lost something that's important to us, for example. And fear, for example, is a response to danger. And these emotions are wholesome insofar as they are needed for our survival, our thriving, and our connection with others. So a constructive emotional behavior is one that's expressed in the right amount proportional to the event that's called it forth. It's expressed at the right time. It's expressed in the right way, appropriate to the trigger and the circumstances. And it does no harm. And generally, emotions further cooperation and collaboration. I suppose sometimes with anger, maybe not so, but anyway, constructive emotionals usually further cooperation and collaboration and an understanding between you and another if it involves another person. As I was mentioning before, it is possible to overcome the suffering of traumatic memories. And it is also possible to decondition, release, let go of, and not reinforce destructive and unhelpful emotions, moods, and states of mind. But it is also possible to cultivate constructive and helpful emotions, moods, and states of mind. So in balance, and it's like we have three emotional systems. The red circle is indicative of the emotions related to survival. The blue circle is representative of emotions that are about thriving and resource seeking and reward-based experiences. So it's about motivating us, driving us to seek things. And the green circle represents the soothing emotions, the emotions that are useful for us to rest and recuperate and also connect with others. So in balance, these emotions provide safety and security, or they represent safety and security, they represent satisfaction and contentment, and they represent connection and being able to soothe things. Now, our human systems have evolved in order to cope with challenges, in order to survive. And there's a hierarchy of responses that follows an increasingly sophisticated coping mechanisms that have evolved. And this hierarchy is like a ladder. At the bottom of the ladder, we go back far in our evolutionary history, back to when we shared genes with other creatures, basic survival mechanisms. And in the middle of the level, there's more evolved survival mechanisms. And at the top of the ladder we have is representing of more recent developments in human evolution, such as what we have in connecting with other beings and connecting with other humans as a fellow human being. So I hope you can see this ladder. At the bottom of the ladder, and I'm referring now to polyvagal theory, but the bottom of the ladder is the dorsal vagal response, which has survival value, and it's when we freeze, when we faint, when we collapse, when we withdraw and dissociate and shut down and cut ourselves off in order to cope. This is the freeze component of the fight, flight, or freeze response to danger. So this has survival value. In our evolutionary past, it would have been very helpful for us to shut down, to faint, to withdraw. And this response has continued into our current contemporary evolutionary being a human right now. It's usually very helpful. It's evolved for us to survive, but at times it can be unhelpful. At times it can develop into what happens when we become depressed, like we withdraw into ourselves, we cut ourselves off, we don't want to know about things. It's also unhelpful when it's also associated to when we dissociate from things. Like dissociation is a good coping mechanism at times, but often it outlives that value, and it becomes a problem. We often cut ourselves off, dissociate from things that are happening around us. We tend to avoid. So dorsal-vagal response, meaning that shut-off is being immobilized, is very helpful at times, but it can also become unhelpful, especially when there's a mismatch between the circumstance that calls forth that response and what's actually needed. Further up the ladder, we have the sympathetic response, which is related to the fight or flight response. And this is triggered by perceptions of danger. And it's usually represented by anger and fear and disgust. And it is mobilized when we need to respond to a danger by either fighting our way through it or escaping from it. Or in terms of disgust, it's about avoiding it, not engaging in it. Like we might have the response of disgust when we smell rotten meat, for example, so we avoid it. And often with human behaviors, sometimes we see disgusting human behaviors that we want to avoid. This sympathetic nervous response, the fight or flight response, very helpful, very necessary for our survival. And of course, it can be unhelpful. It can be, it can shift into disorders, for example, like anxiety responses. It can shift into traits and behaviors that are quite destructive. And higher up on this ladder, we have what's called the ventral vagal response, which is more about connecting. It's connecting. It's the connection with other beings. It's the way we are very tuned into what's happening with another being, and we call on that sense of connection. When we feel disconnected from others, well, if you go back into our evolutionary history, for us to be disconnected from the tribe, to be rejected from the tribe, would have meant great danger. So for humans, it's very important that we relate to others, and we're constantly sensitive to cues of connection. We're always on the lookout for whether someone's frowning at us or someone's smiling at us. This is very important in our lives, and this ventral vagal response refers to relying on these connections to overcome a difficulty. And it's about taking care of ourselves, and this is probably the optimal response to difficulties. It's higher up on the evolutionary ladder, and what's interesting is that with Buddhist meditation practices, we have something called the Four Divine Abodes, which are loving kindness, or warm benevolence, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity. And these Four Divine Abodes are relationship qualities. They're about connecting with others. They're about our relationship with ourselves and others. And I feel that this ventral vagal response provides the basics for these really divine and high-level ways of responding to experience. That's just as a matter of interest. So there's the Four Divine Abodes: loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity. Metta, karuna, mudita, and upekkha. So as I was saying before, these responses are really natural. It's natural for us to want to withdraw. It's natural for us to want to fight or flight. It's natural for us to engage with other beings. But in terms of that sympathetic nervous response and also the dorsal vagal response, that one of us wanting to withdraw, there's often a mismatch. And we might become anxious and stressed, for example, or depressed and dissociated when we need not be like that. And you remember that picture that I showed you before of the emotional systems in balance? Sometimes it might look like this, where the threat system's completely out of proportion. The drive system is kind of a bit distorted and not working properly, and that calming connection system is satelliting out there at a distance, not really having an impact on regulating our emotions and balancing our drives and so on. It is possible to break free from the binds of being stuck in stress, anxiety, and depression. And it is possible to ask ourselves, is this the right response for the situation? And I was listening to a talk by Deb Dana, who's a clinical psychologist who is an expert on polyvagal theory and using polyvagal theory in therapy. And she said that what we do when we notice a mismatch between our responses and the events that call them forth, what we do is we ask ourselves, is this the right response? And we cultivate discernment. So the way she talked about cultivating discernment is with mindfulness. And with mindfulness, which is remembering to be attentive to our current experience, our immediate experience, and it is also, as a practice, it's being able to track our experiences of body, feelings, states of mind or emotions, and phenomena. Being able to track these experiences, turning towards them and looking into them and inquiring into them and tracking them so we understand them, so we can choose to feed into them or not feed into them. This is the way we cultivate discernment, which is the way we cultivate wisdom. And I've written down here, easy said, hard to do, but it is doable. And that's the practice. So I know many of you, some of you are clinical psychologists or psychologists, and you're probably very aware of the symptoms of trauma. Here are some of the symptoms of post-trauma, there's often a misperception of current events. For example, we often overreact. There's a mismatch between our emotional reaction and the triggers that sparked off that. There's an increased startle response. We might be quite jumpy. There's often our sleep is disturbed. There's often hypervigilance. We're kind of on the lookout. We might be having, often we're having intrusive thoughts, flashbacks. Often, if we're not having flashbacks during the day, when we're asleep, we'll have nightmares. We're obviously distressed at reminders of the events that would have caused our traumatic response. And we'll often go into avoidance behaviors. So these are just some of the symptoms. But it's interesting how these symptoms come about, because it's often about what happens in our brain. And I just want to kind of go into sharing something about what happens in our brain. A little bit of neuroscience to kind of give some ideas about what happens with our reactions and what keeps us in suffering. There's a part of the brain called the hippocampus. And I'm not a neuroscientist and I'm not a neuropsychologist, and what I'll be saying about these parts of the brain and the functions of the brain is just some things that I've picked up. So I'm not an expert on this, but I think just a little bit of knowledge is really, really helpful. It's helpful for us in being able to have an understanding of what's happening for us. When we have knowledge, it is empowering. So there's a part of our brain called the hippocampus. Its function is to store memories. Usually stores the facts. Something about storing memories, it's like if we could compare memory storage, the storage of the events that happen in our lives, to a digital image, like taking a digital image of something. So in that digital image, you may have a time signature, for example, a time signature about when that picture was taken. And in the case of hippocampus, you could compare it to having a time signature in the hippocampus saying, this is when that event occurred. The other thing about taking a digital image with a camera or whatever is that it creates an accurate representation of that, an accurate record of that image, of that event, so that it's highly pixelated, it's clear, and it's differentiated, and it's an accurate representation of the image that it took. Now, the hippocampus, I've heard from a neuroscientist, has a lot of cortisol receptor sites around it. So cortisol receptor sites mean that it picks up cortisol. It's sensitive to cortisol. So cortisol will attach to the hippocampus. Cortisol is a stress hormone, and what happens is when we're stressed, we secrete cortisol, it goes to the hippocampus, and it affects the way memories are stored. What might happen is that it might affect the time signature, for example. What might happen, it might affect the pixels of the image, if we're comparing it to an image. The details of the memory, it may be hazy. And there's other features of the memory that are incomplete. So when we're stressed, or when we're having a trauma, when we're really, having all this cortisol released from our system, it's affecting the hippocampus, it's affecting the way the memories are stored. What happens with that is that when we can begin to have inaccurate associations with events. We might, for example, with a hazy image or a hazy memory, we might see one thing as another. There's a generalizing of one event to another. What happens is we have this memory, and then when we sleep, it's processed, it's consolidated. So if the memory was hazy to begin with, or it had the wrong time signature, then we're having a misrepresentation of the event, and it's consolidated in that way, and often it's not really processed properly. And this is the point I wanted to make. We may generalize one aspect of that memory to many things, and we make inaccurate associations. And because the time signature is out of whack, later on, we may feel that the stressful event that we experienced at one time in the past is happening in current time, if that makes sense. So with traumas, we are often unable to sleep and process the memories, and it is consolidated inaccurately. So coming now to the amygdala. The amygdala, you can see it there on the screen. It's quite close to the hippocampus, so there's a strong relationship to it. They communicate backwards and forwards. And the amygdala is the center of our emotions, basically. It's it's where we, it works like a smoke alarm system. It gets triggered to respond to situations emotionally. It triggers us to, I mean, there's a whole range of processes that occur, but it will spark off an emotional response depending on the situation. The thing about the amygdala is that it learns quickly. We may, as a child, for example, as a toddler, we only need to touch a boiling pot once for the amygdala to learn that we need to be afraid of boiling pots. It doesn't take much. One event can occur and we can be triggered for multiple events. So you think about this. You think about an event occurring. The amygdala gets kind of conditioned to respond to an event. And then we get it communicating with the hippocampus, which is giving the memories of that event. And if the memories are kind of hazy, there's a gross generalization process. So imagine, for example, that you were treated badly by a school teacher, back in primary school or maybe even kindergarten or something like that, and you got quite frightened of that school teacher. And that school teacher happened to be a balding, kind of oldish man with glasses and a beard. And what happens then is that throughout your life you become very cautious whenever you see a balding man, middle to late aging with a beard, and you can't really connect the events, but for some reason or other you just get anxious every time you see someone with glasses, balding, and with a beard, a male. So this is what happens with trauma. It's like we learn experiences, and the memories are hazy, the memories are not quite clear, the time signature's not right. So we might be reminded of that trauma because the amygdala is doing its role. The amygdala is there for us to learn quickly, and we just react. We continue to be stuck in this reaction. It's like the traumatic memory is having an effect on us. So something that happens with the amygdala, well, there's a term called amygdala hijacking. And what happens here is that there's a stimulus that goes to our amygdala, we sense danger, and it just takes over. It takes over the whole system, and it blocks us from having rational reasoning coming from a prefrontal cortex, actually, to help us deal with the situation appropriately. It helps us discern what's going on and act appropriately. But what happens with amygdala hijack is that it blocks that and it just takes over, takes control of the system. So we're reacting to things inappropriately. We're having inappropriate destructive emotions in response to something that we need not do. So, as I mentioned earlier, it is possible to decondition, release, and let go of and not reinforce destructive and unhelpful emotional reactions. And the amygdala can unlearn. In addition, our memories can be reconsolidated so that we can see the way things actually are, rather than our projecting our vague, inaccurately recorded memories on those events. The way we unlearn with the amygdala is sort of pairing up a positive experience with the negative reaction. And here's an example. Coming back to that experience of having a painful experience when we're young with a man who has, who's slightly balding, and glasses, and beard, and so on. What we do in that reaction is that we start to generalize all men with beards and glasses to being signs of danger. So our system reacts in an unhelpful way, like a post-traumatic stress response. If, however, we start to have experiences of a warm, benevolent man with glasses and a beard and balding, slightly balding, and we continue to have those experiences in situations where there's no danger and it's in fact quite safe, and the experience is of benevolence, then slowly our amygdala can decondition. It can decondition so that it doesn't respond to all beings, all men with beards and glasses and balding, so that there's it learns, it relearns. And the other thing that can happen is our memories can have reconsolidation. Now, memory consolidation is a mechanism for the brain to update existing learning with new ones. It is a way of, it's a scientific term, it's called memory reconsolidation theory. It's about bringing up those memories, so they're kind of in a space, a psychic space, and then providing alternative information to those memories so that they then reconsolidate in a way that's more in line with the alternative information or the reality of that situation. I hope I haven't really explained it that well yet, but I'll try to go into this a little bit more. The factors necessary for reconsolidation, in other words, the factors necessary for us to make memories of an event more complete, more accurate, to correct the time signature and so on, to reshape what we learned from the past. The factors of reconsolidation are these. The emotional memory needs to be vividly accessed. It needs to kind of come up in psychic space somehow. Then there needs to be a juxtaposition of experience. In other words, an experience that contradicts the original experience that laid down that memory. And the conclusions that were drawn from that original memory, that original experience, so that we can be aware of an alternative emotional, somatic, and conceptual difference. There's a discrepancy between the original event and the event that we're experiencing with our new experience. Then the other factor is there needs to be a pairing of the positive with the negative, and it needs to be repeated. So it is possible to cultivate and reinforce helpful emotions and moods, and we can build up psychological resources, and we can heal and recover and wake up to the reality of the situation, especially with serenity, insight, and intentions of goodwill. So I'm going to explain how this works in a minute. So there is I think it's like this. What's important when I see people for traumatic memory resolution or working with their traumatic memories, for example, what's important is that I create a circumstance, create a situation, and contain that situation, a situation of safety and goodwill. And what we do is people will bring it up anyway. They'll bring up that emotional response, and the emotional response is happening in a situation where there's juxtaposed information coming through. The traumatic emotional response is occurring, but it's occurring in a situation where there's a juxtaposition of experience. So in that way, the memories of it are being changed. They're becoming more complete. And they're being able to then be reconsolidated in a helpful way. Sometimes the way we do this is provide a lot of psychological resources so that we can, so that when we bring up the traumatic memory or the traumatic experience, it just becomes irrelevant in that it becomes untenable or irrelevant or unimportant in that that container of psychological resources. Now, I think I'll try to explain this using an analogy. And I read about this analogy recently in a sutta, and I know it wasn't, the way they used this analogy wasn't exactly in line with what I'm talking about now, but the analogy is of salt in water. And if we had a teaspoon of salt and we put it in a glass of water, it would transform that water to be undrinkable. It would taste horrible, it would taste salty, and also we would not be able to drink it completely because it's salt. It's salty. It's it's in a small space. If, however, a large, fresh, water drinkable lake, a teaspoon of salt in the lake, and it doesn't make a difference. It means nothing. We can drink as much water as we like, and the taste of the salt wouldn't even be there because it's so small and irrelevant. It's like this. If we can cultivate a wealth of psychological resources, if we can cultivate our hearts so that they're filled with compassion and kindness and wisdom, if we can develop our minds, if we can see clearly, and if we can cultivate serenity, insight, and the heart qualities, it's like we have a wealth of resources. It's like we have a lake full of psychological resources. Then when we pair our mind, that experience up with a negative experience, a painful experience, it's like putting a teaspoon of salt in a big lake. It's irrelevant. It's meaningless. It's not that we forget that it's there, but it just becomes irrelevant. It's nothing. So Rick Hanson has developed this acronym called HEAL. HEAL is what it is. It's a healing acronym. It refers to experiences that have a healing effect. So the H of this acronym refers to having or imagining or remembering a positive experience. The E of this acronym refers to enriching this experience with words, reminders, images, and imagination. Enriching it in whatever way you can. And the A of this acronym refers to absorbing into the experience. It's like relaxing into it, letting it sink in and marinating in the experience. So in many respects, this is like cultivating serenity. In many respects, this is like, for example, having an experience of deep equanimity, or having an experience of warm benevolence, love, or kindness and compassion. What we can do is we can enrich these experiences with words, with reminders, with images and imagination. In fact, when we cultivate loving kindness, we often use words like, may I be happy, may I be peaceful, or may you be happy, peaceful, free, and so on. And we use these words and reminders sometimes. Sometimes when I cultivate loving kindness, I think of a benefactor, someone who Or I remind myself of someone who's had a lot of love for me. I actually see their face in mind, and I pick up on the cues of their warm, smiling face and their eyes and so on. And this has an effect of enriching this experience of loving kindness or metta in my heart. If I was cultivating equanimity, it would be similar. I could remember a time when I felt really, really peaceful and calm, clear, stable, unshaken by the events in life. Then I can enrich it with words like peace or calm, or reminders. Like I could think of some of my teachers that are completely equanimous. Some memory of some teachers, and I'm getting teary thinking about it, but just their sense of stability, their sense of unshakability. Then when I awaken that quality, when I stimulate that quality, I can let go of the words, the reminders, the images, the imagination, and just absorb into that quality. Let it marinate through me. Let it pervade every cell of my body, every part of my being. So this is what Rick Hanson's talking about with HEA is very similar to what we do with serenity meditations. In fact, there's a kind of a correlation with those 5 factors of the 5 jhana factors. Then we come to link. The link. Sometimes people call it learn. The L of this acronym. And this link is about having that lake, the wealth of psychological experiences, the wealth of loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, joy, peace, calm, and then linking it to, like putting a teaspoon of salt in that lake. Linking it to a memory that was not so useful, was not so helpful, that was traumatic, in fact. Something that was opposite to the way we're experiencing, but linking in a way where it's only kind of in the background. It's so minor that it just dissolves away. It has no impact. So in that way, we then apply insight. It's like we see the reality of this experience. It's just a memory. It's just something that's happened in the past. Our memories are kind of we're having this sense of readjusting our memory of the experience to bring it in line with reality. It is in the past. It's not happening now. It was dangerous then, but now I'm safe. So these experiences become real for us. It's put into perspective. So this linking component, the first part of this heal, having, enriching, absorbing, is very similar to serenity meditation, where we're cultivating a state of mind, we're focusing on one thing and we're becoming absorbed in that experience. Then we're using that strength of insight to link into another experience that's the opposite of that, and that linking gives us insight. It helps it develop, and there's this pairing of experiences, and as a result, we overcome the suffering of those difficult experiences. Having an experience is like acknowledging what is right and good right now, or in the recent past, or in your character, or in the experience you're having. It's about recognizing the good qualities, the facts, the contributions of another, and your relationship to them. It is realizing the good feelings that you're having right now. Enriching the experiences refers to using whatever you can to remind you of these experiences. Absorbing in them is that very process of becoming one with them, becoming one with the positive, letting it pervade you, letting it soak into you. there's some analogies that are used for the various levels of jhana. Jhanas are states of high concentration. An analogy for the first jhana, for cultivating this first jhana, is like kneading a ball of soap, so that it's massaging a ball of soap, so that the experience becomes the experience of piety, in this case, of uplifted feeling of energy and well-being and joy, is pervading one's whole being. The analogy for the second jhana is like the second jhana, which is a main feature of the second jhana, is happiness or sukha. Analogy for that is like the cool of a spring water coming up into a warm pool. It just comes up from below and it spreads throughout the whole pool, like the whole pool becomes cool. So that's the analogy of happiness. The analogy for the third jhana, which is, this third jhana is, a feature of the third jhana is sukha and equanimity combined, which is like a contentment with the experience, like a sublime contentment. The analogy that's used in the sutras is of a lotus flower, a whole lotus flower underneath the water. So its roots and its stem and its flower is completely submerged in the water, and it's soaked, it's saturated with the water. So what's inside and outside the pond is the same. What is inside and outside the lotus plant is the same. It's completely saturated with moisture. So this is an analogy. This is an analogy of this third jhana. It is like that contentment, that feeling of contentment saturates your body, saturates your being. And an analogy for the fourth jhana, the feature of the fourth jhana is equanimity, that is unshaken. It's neither pleasant or unpleasant. It's just perfectly unshaken, still, quiet. The analogy that's used is as a person covered with a sheet, a cloth that's luminous. So one gets a sense of being somewhat insulated against the hassles of the world, the worldly conditions, at the same time as being luminously aware, brightly aware of it all. So when we're talking about absorption, we're talking about these qualities, becoming completely absorbed in these qualities, or whatever the positive quality is, that is opposite to the memory that you linked it to, you might link it to. So the insight that arises about that painful memory or that painful event is that it's not your fault, for example. It's in the past. Right now I'm safe. It's just a passing image, thought, belief, assumption, etc. It's not the truth of things. I can find peace with this. I can be empowered. And this process is like putting salt into a lake. Okay, so thank you very much. I hope this talk has been helpful.